Okay, thanks so much. So thanks for inviting me. I will talk about a book that I wrote called The Power of Creative Destruction. It's a book with Céline Antonin, who is at Sciences Po Paris and the Collège de France with me, and Simon Bunel, who is at INSEE, which is a statistical institute, Banque de France, and Collège de France with me. So creative destruction is this term coined by Joseph Schumpeter to refer to the process whereby new innovations displace old technologies. New innovations make old technologies become obsolete. Okay, for example, in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, Schumpeter, explains what he means by creative destruction. Okay, so, but when I studied economics, there was no growth model based on creative destruction. You see, there was the Solow model, or the Ramsey model, or the Harold Domar model. All those were models where growth was primarily driven by capital accumulation. All what Bob Solow would say is that in the absence of technical progress on the reasonable assumptions of decreasing returns to capital accumulation, you could not explain long-run growth of per capita GDP. You needed something called technical progress. The problem is that Solow would not tell you where technical progress would come from. And so when I studied growth, and of course I heard about Schumpeter and the creative destruction, and I said, where is the model? There was no model. Where is the empirical analysis? There was no empirical analysis. So with my colleague, Peter Howitt, in 1987, we decided to write a model of growth which embodies Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction. So this model revolved around three main ideas. The first idea is that long-run growth is driven by a cumulative process of innovation, where each innovator builds upon previous innovation. The second idea is that innovations result from entrepreneurial activities motivated by the prospect of innovation rents. If you innovate, you get rents from it, which are typically temporary monopoly rents, because you do better on new product or you produce cheaper than competitors or whatever, and at least for a while, you get rents from this. And the third idea is creative destruction. New innovations displace old technologies. The new destroys the old. So you see right away that at the heart of the growth process, you have a contradiction. On the one hand, you need innovation rents to motivate future innovation and to motivate R&D and other type of innovative activity. But on the other hand, yesterday's innovators are very tempted to use their rents to prevent subsequent innovations because they don't want themselves to be subject to creative destruction. You see, they don't want themselves to be replaced by new innovators. And what's interesting is that this contradiction lies at the heart of everything. Whether you talk about secular stagnation, inequality, middle income trap, green innovation, you come trying to explain the growth takeoff in Europe in the 19th century, you always come across this contradiction. Okay, and regulating capitalism, it's mainly about how to deal with this contradiction. You need rents to motivate innovation, but those rents can be used ex post by yesterday's innovators to prevent subsequent innovation. Schumpeter himself was deeply pessimistic about the future of capitalism because he thought that the first innovators would turn into entrenched conglomerates that would successfully bribe the state and prevent subsequent innovation. In this book, we are much more optimistic than Schumpeter because we believe that there are forces that can be activated which avert the pessimistic prediction that he had. That's why we advocate an optimism of the will, okay, instead of pessimism. So what we do in the book is to use the lens of creative destruction and of this framework with Peter Howitt to do three main things: to revisit some main enigma in economic history, to question some common wisdoms, to rethink the future of capitalism. Since I only have 15 minutes, I will just touch upon that, okay? So, for example, the historical enigma we looked at is the industrial takeoff. Why did it take place in the 19th century in Europe and not in China, where you had many inventions? We do that in chapter 2 of the book. I won't have time to talk about it. Another enigma is the secular stagnation. Why did productivity growth decline in the US since the early 2000s in spite of the IT and AI revolution? The middle income trap, why some countries start growing and they stop in the middle, or growth slows down, like in South Korea or like in Japan or whatever. And another enigma is inequality. What is the relationship between inequality and innovation? Here, I will just tell you about the secular stagnation. So if you look at TFP growth, the average annual rate of TFP growth went down since, after going up a lot between 95 2005 in the US, it went down since 2005. And we discussed that in chapter 6 of the book, but the most plausible, what's very interesting, this rise followed by decline of productivity growth was mainly in IT producing sectors in black and in IT using sectors in gray. And what's interesting is that it was mirrored by the fact that entry of new firms increased first and then declined. And the most plausible story is the fact that with the IT revolution, it facilitated the emergence of superstar firms, Walmart, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, which were better organized and took advantage of IT. At first, they boosted productivity growth when they expanded throughout the US economy. But eventually, once they invaded many sectors of the US economy, they inhibited entry by non-superstar firms. And that's why you have this decline of entry. And that's very interesting because Schumpeter would tell you that's exactly what was my prediction. There is nothing else you can do. Bob Gordon would have said there is nothing we can do, although Bob Gordon is changing his mind, I think. And our response is to say, no, if you adapt competition policy in the US to the digital era, if you know how to better regulate merger and acquisitions, and you deal with the lack of competition appropriately, and then you can revert this downward trend, and you can deal with the secular stagnation. You just need to adapt competition policy to the digital era to make it much more dynamic. When you decide whether or not to allow for a new merger and acquisition, you look at the effect that this merger would have on subsequent innovation and subsequent entry, instead of looking just at market share and market definition. So that really illustrates where we are more optimistic. It doesn't mean that necessarily these competition reforms will take place, but at least we know where the culprit lies, and we know what has to be done, and we know which kind of forces can be activated to make that happen, okay? So the second thing, the middle income trap, very quickly, Korea was growing very fast between World War II and particularly between 1960 and 1990, and then the per capita GDP growth rate declined since then. And the reason is very much related to the Schumpetarian contradiction. During the high growth of Korea was a catching up growth. But that's something that could happen also in Poland or in Central and Eastern Europe. It was a catching up growth, where you catch up with more advanced technology. During this catching up phase, conglomerates grew up, and they are called chobols in Korea. These conglomerates eventually became, not only they inhibited new entry, but they also put pressure on the Korean government to prevent moving towards institutions that are good for innovation-based growth. You see, the institutions that are good for catching up growth are not the same as the institutions that favor growth at the frontier. When you are growing at the frontier, competition turns out to be very important, much more than if you are catching up. And those firms, of course, they didn't want more competition. And we explained in chapter 7 that the financial crisis of the late 90s weakened the power of the chobols, and that allowed new non-chobol firms to enter and innovate, and it also forced the Korean government to implement more pro-competition policies, which in fact boosted growth. So that's something that we show there. So those are examples, you see, of enigma that you could not understand without the Schumpeterian framework. Okay, now the second thing we do is to question some common wisdom, some wrong ideas. One wrong idea is that you should tax robots to protect employment. But in fact, we've done, in chapter 2 of the book, we explained that firms in France that automate, they create employment. Now you might be surprised, how come when you automate, you create employment? Because, you know, robots and other automation devices, essentially they have the effect of replacing manpower. So how come you create employment? And what we explain is that firms that automate, they become more productive. Because they become more productive, they increase sales, and in particular export sales, as you can see here. And that's why they increase the demand for their product, and that's why employment goes up. Of course, what they do is that they destroy employment in firms that do not automate. So you have business stealing. When the firm automates, it tends to reduce employment in competing firms that do not automate. And that's what we explained. But if you now tax robots, you would inhibit, prevent those firms from automating, and therefore from becoming more productive, and therefore from increasing their sales, and therefore from increasing demand for their product, and therefore from employing more. And in fact, typically, when firms cannot automate, they outsource. The other alternative to get cheap labor or to get a good, to reduce quality-adjusted prices is to just outsource production into countries where labor is cheaper. So the way to avoid or to minimize the scope of outsourcing is to let firms automate. Okay, now I get to the last part. Let me drink some water because I'm a bit, otherwise I will get dehydrated. That's great to be near your fridge so you can get water right directly. Voila. So the third thing that we explain in the book is that, in fact, creative destruction gives you a way to rethink capitalism. COVID turned out to be a revelator. It showed that you had a broken social model in the US. We knew that, but it was enhanced by COVID. And it also showed the extent to which the innovation ecosystem in Europe is below the efficiency frontier. So, for example, if here you look, US is the gray and Germany is the black. Triangles are the share of a population without employment, without a job. And the circles are the share of population without health insurance. You see that the share of US population without health insurance went down with the Obamacare, but it went up again with COVID. Why? Because when you lose your employment in the US, you have a probability of also losing health insurance. So at the time where they needed health insurance, a fraction of population lost health insurance. Nothing such in Germany. I could have put the Scandinavian countries, I could have put France, Italy, Spain. We have a different social model. We are better insuring the most vulnerable fractions of the population against a shock like COVID. Also, jobs, I didn't show you, but when you lose your job in Denmark, it has no effect on health. We explained that in chapter 11 of the book. No negative effect because they have a system called flex security. When you lose your job in Denmark, for 3 years, you have 90% of your salary. The state helps you find a new job and they retrain you. Then they propose you new jobs. If you refuse more than 2, you lose the unemployment insurance. But this system, is very good because it means that when you get unemployed, you become unemployed in Denmark, no bad effect on health. In the US, terrible effects on health, as explained by Deaton and Case, and that we explained that at length in chapter 11. So the social model in the US is not very good. But on the other hand, when it comes to innovation, you can see here I look at the number of trading patents per million inhabitants. You see the US is in blue, it dominates EU 27 and dominates China. So they are better innovating. And if, for example, I look at biotech patents, you look, for example, 2016, but we are very much like in 2016. The number of biotech patents per million inhabitants, US again dominates EU 27 and China. Okay, why? Because they have a better ecosystem of innovation. Basic research first is very well funded in the US with very well funded universities, with the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health, the private donors, institutions like the Howard Hughes Medical Investigator that finances basic research in biotech. They have a fantastic financing system for basic research. And then when you go into creating new startups, they have venture capital very well developed. They have business angels very well developed. They have also the BARDA and the DARPA. The DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, created during the Cold War because they were racing with the Soviet Union on weapons and space. And you had missions to fulfill, like putting a man in space in 2 years. So you need to coordinate resources and actors. And those things are very effective. The basic research is done, but you need to coordinate actors and resources to achieve those missions. So the money comes from the ministry. You give the money to team leaders. They elicit a competing project. So it's a mixture of top-down and bottom-up. And the competing project help fulfill the mission. So they did that with defense and space with the DARPA. Internet, GPS, autonomous navigation in the US comes from DARPA, indirectly or indirectly. Then they created the BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. That's what produced the vaccine. The RNA messenger technology was available from basic research. You had to turn that into production, mass production of vaccines within a year. And that's what the BARDA did, exactly the same organization as DARPA, but for biotech. And, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson, all those guys were directly or indirectly helped by the BARDA, okay? So the US, they spent $12 billion on BARDA last year. That's thanks to that we are all now together, okay? So now, ideally, my model of capitalism is one which would combine the good side of the American model, innovation, with the good side of the European model, protection. Some people believe that to be more innovative, you have to give up on protection and inclusion. And if you want to be more productive and inclusive, you need to give up on being more innovative. And I don't believe that. I believe there are at least three types of policies which makes you both more innovative and more protective and inclusive. One is the flex security that I told you about. When the Danes introduced the flex security system on the labor market, they made creative destruction work much more efficiently. It was much easier for firms to hire and lay off, because once you have a laid off worker, the worker will be retrained and put back more quickly into the labor market, okay, with the state help. And that's what the flex security achieved. So the flex security made both spurred innovation in Denmark by making creative destruction work better and by giving the flexibility to the firms. But at the same time, it was very good at protecting individuals, hence the absence of negative effect of becoming unemployed on health in Denmark. So flex security is an example, makes you both more innovative and more protective. The second policy is education. Here I'm showing you the probability of inventing as a function of where the parental income, okay? And you see that in the US nowadays, or in the US historical, or in Finland also, you are much more likely to innovate. The vertical axis is the probability of an individual to innovate. The horizontal axis is where which centiles of the income distribution the parent income lies, okay? So here are the richest parents, the poorer parents. And you see that you're much more likely to innovate when you have, high earning parents, okay? So why is that? It's all the more surprising that it's true also in Finland, because in Finland, education up to university is totally free and high quality. But it turns out that in Finland, the high earning parents are also the more educated parents, and they transmit aspirations and knowledge to their children, which is a huge input to becoming an innovator. So when I control for parental education in Finland, you see that this J curve flattens out a lot. Now, you see, you could say, well, but still, why should parental education matter when you have such a good schooling system in Finland? But the reason is that they have that system only since 1970. The big educational reform that make education available to everybody, high quality in Finland, was in 1970. When you restrict attention to researchers who went through the schooling system post-1970, there is no more relationship with parental income or parental education. The curve becomes completely flat. So why is that important? Because in fact, in our countries, we have a lot of what we call lost Einstein. Those are very smart children born to parents who don't have the education and or don't have the financial support they can provide to their children to go to school and become inventors. So we have these lost Einsteins. And now if you move to the current education system in Finland, this kind of education system, high quality and very inclusive, you will make the economy much more innovative because much more people can become innovators. But also you make growth more inclusive because more people can enter the growth process. So here education is also a policy that makes you both more innovative and more protective. And finally, competition. I told you before that the decline in TFT growth in the US had a lot to do with the competition policy, which was not adequate to the current times. If you now reform competition policy, like what the Biden administration tried to do last year, hopefully, we'll see if it has the effects we want, but if you manage to reform competition policy, it will spur entry. You see that entry rate of new firms decline in the US. Hopefully, you could revert this curve. That means that you will have more entrant innovation. So that means you have more innovative economy. But as we show in the book in chapter 5, entrant innovation also increases social mobility, because in fact, creative destruction, which is the entry of new firms, means that you have new people replacing old people. You have new people, new wealthy replacing old wealthy. So if you spur entrant innovation, not only you make the economy more innovative, but also more inclusive, because you boost social mobility. And when you boost social mobility, you tend to reduce global inequality. So it's very interesting that, those three policies, flex security, education, and competition, makes you both more innovative and more protective and inclusive. So now I go back to my early, my initial statement. You remember I started with Schumpeter's pessimism that yesterday's innovators would turn into entrenched conglomerates that would successfully bribe the government to prevent new entry. Now, you can try to undo that by having competition policy. But the problem is that, like we saw with the middle income trap, incumbent firms like the Chobals in Korea can bribe the government to not implement competition policy. Now, you could say, well, you could have the judiciary to control the executive, but that may not work. There is nothing that makes sure that the Constitution is enforced, because the Constitution is an incomplete contract. So that's where civil society is crucial, because civil society, which means the media, the unions, the voters, is there as a watchdog to make sure that the state will play its role in regulating firms and in making sure that incumbent firms will not block new entry. And that's why this triangle between firms, the state, and civil society is the response to Schumpeter's pessimism. It doesn't mean that necessarily this triangle will be activated, but the forces exist to be activated. So the idea of this triangle came from Bowles and Carlin, but here we use it to deal with the Schumpeterian contradiction and show that the triangle is key to making sure that creative destruction can be sustained and also can be directed towards greener innovation. Because spontaneously, firms do not innovate in green technologies, as we explained in chapter 9. Firms that innovated in dirty technologies in the past tend to continue innovating in dirty technologies in the future. So you need the state to redirect technical change of firms towards clean technology, but the state can do it through carbon tax and smart subsidy to green innovation. But civil society has a role to play as a watchdog that the state is doing what it should be done, because the state, again, could be bribed by firms to not implement green innovation. And also civil society directly, the consumers have a role to play to push firms to innovate and produce greener. More and more you have B Corp and other type of things that whereby consumers act as direct, and the civil society as a direct watchdog to make sure that firms behave as they should. So that concludes what I wanted to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor.